I'm a 32-year-old guy, and my life turned upside down 3 months ago. My parents passed away in a car accident. Losing them was devastating, but what followed after their deaths shook me to my core. I thought we were a typical family with no major secrets, but I couldn't have been more wrong. It started at the reading of the will. My brother Ryan, who's 35, and I were the only heirs. I wasn't expecting much. My parents weren't millionaires or anything, but they owned a nice house, had some savings, and there were a few family heirlooms that I thought would be split between us. At least that's what they'd always said. We'll make sure everything is fair, my mom used to repeat. The lawyer read the will, and that's when I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. Everything was left to Ryan. The house, the savings, the family jewelry, even the old antique clock that had been in the family for generations. I, on the other hand, got a single box of sentimental items. That was it. The box was sitting right there in the room, dusty and unimpressive, like some forgotten afterthought. I sat there, stunned, trying to make sense of it. My brother didn't look surprised. He had this smug expression, like he'd known all along. I asked the lawyer if there had been a mistake. Maybe there was another will or something hadn't been filed correctly. The lawyer shook his head. The will was airtight, written, and signed months before their deaths. After the meeting, I asked Ryan if he had known about this. He shrugged and said, "It's mom and dad's final decision. You should respect it." Respect it. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Growing up, they'd always told me and Ryan that we'd split everything equally. But now he was the golden child, and I was left with a box of junk. Looking back, I shouldn't have been surprised. My parents always favored Ryan. He got everything handed to him, a private school education, a car on his 16th birthday, and a fully paid college tuition. Meanwhile, I was scraping together part-time jobs to afford a state school. Whenever I brought it up, my parents would brush it off, saying I was independent and didn't need the same help. I guess that favoritism didn't end when they died. When I got home, I opened the box. It was filled with old photos, random trinkets, and a few yellowed letters. Most of it didn't seem important, just stuff from my childhood. There were a few photos of me and Ryan playing as kids, some postcards my parents had collected, and a locket with my mom's initials on it. It felt more like a consolation prize than an inheritance. I couldn't let it go. I talked to a lawyer about contesting the will, but he said it was hopeless. The will had been updated recently and was legally binding. There was no evidence of coercion or fraud. My parents' decision, as baffling as it seemed, was final. Meanwhile, Ryan wasted no time flaunting his new wealth. He moved into our childhood home, tore out the garden my mom had loved so much, and started making expensive renovations. It felt like a slap in the face every time I drove by. He didn't just inherit the house, he was erasing all the memories attached to it. Our extended family wasn't much help. Some told me to move on and accept my parents' wishes. A few offered their sympathy but stayed quiet to avoid getting involved. I could see them whispering at family gatherings, exchanging glances whenever I walked into the room. I felt like the outcast, the one who was causing trouble by even questioning the will. One night, as I was going through the box again, I found something I hadn't noticed before. It was a letter addressed to me, tucked inside an old photo album. The envelope was faded, and the handwriting was my dad's. My hands were shaking as I opened it. The letter was vague. It apologized for mistakes and said they hoped I'd understand someday. Understand what? There was no explanation, no mention of the will, and no reason why Ryan got everything. It felt like my dad had left me a puzzle with half the pieces missing. But something about the letter didn't sit right with me. The phrasing was off, like he was trying to say more without actually writing it. That's when I remembered an old family friend, Mr. Davis, who had a falling out with my parents years ago. He'd been close to us when I was a kid, but something happened, and they stopped talking. If anyone knew more about my parents' decisions, it might be him. I tried talking to Ryan again, hoping for some clarity, but he dismissed me. He called me bitter and accused me of playing the victim. He said I should just be happy with what I got. Happy? With a dusty box of memories while he inherited everything? That night, I spread out the contents of the box on my living room floor. I started going through every photo, every letter, looking for anything that could explain what had happened. There were dates and places written on the backs of some photos, and a few trinkets that seemed out of place. The more I looked, the more questions I had. I wasn't ready to give up. If my parents had secrets, I was going to find them. Update 1. After finding my dad's cryptic letter, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. I kept thinking about Mr. Davis, the old family friend who had a falling out with my parents. I decided to track him down. It wasn't hard. Small-town rumors travel fast, and someone gave me his phone number. He was hesitant to meet at first, but after I mentioned the will, he agreed to sit down. We met at a diner just outside of town. He looked older, but the moment he started talking, I could tell he hadn't forgotten anything. He told me my parents had gone through serious financial troubles about a decade ago, something I had never known. The family business, which I always assumed was steady, had been on the verge of collapse. According to him, Ryan had stepped in with a large sum of money to save it. I asked why no one had told me, and he shrugged, saying, "Your parents didn't want you to worry. They thought you wouldn't understand." Then he dropped another bombshell. The will might have been their way of repaying Ryan. It wasn't just favoritism, it was a way to balance the books. He didn't have proof, but the pieces started clicking into place. I thanked him and left, my mind racing. When I got home, I started digging through my parents' old business records. I found their tax returns, invoices and bank statements in a filing cabinet in the attic. At first, everything seemed normal. Then I noticed something odd, huge withdrawals and deposits around the time Mr. Davis mentioned. There were also names of companies I didn't recognize, and one document had Ryan's name on it. It was a partial contract, but it didn't explain much. I added it to the pile of questions I already had. The next step was obvious. I had to confront Ryan. I went to the house, where he was overseeing more renovations. He was standing in the driveway, barking orders at some workers. When I brought up the financial records and asked why I was never told about his involvement in the business, he brushed me off. He said I didn't care about the business back then, so it wasn't my concern. Things escalated quickly, and we were shouting. He accused me of being jealous, and I accused him of keeping secrets. He stormed back into the house, slamming the door behind him. Frustrated, I turned to my extended family for answers, but they were no help. My aunt said she didn't want to get involved. My uncle muttered something about family being complicated and walked away. It was like everyone had decided this wasn't their problem. The few who seemed sympathetic still wouldn't say much, like they were afraid of stirring up drama. That night, I went back to the box of photos. I spread them out again, looking for anything I might have missed. That's when I noticed something strange. Some of the photos showed my dad at formal events with people I didn't recognize. One picture had him shaking hands with a man in a suit, standing in front of what looked like an office building. On the back, my dad had written July 2010, big day. But what day? And who was the man? I started piecing the photos together, arranging them by date. They painted a picture of my dad meeting with people, attending what looked like business lunches, and spending time at places I didn't remember him mentioning. Something about these photos felt off. Why hadn't my parents ever talked about these moments? And why were they mixed in with random trinkets in this box? Then there was the letter. I read it again, slowly this time. A phrase caught my attention. We tried to do what was best for everyone. It sounded more like guilt than reassurance. What had they done, and why didn't they think I deserved to know? I decided to take the photos and the contract to someone who might be able to help. A lawyer friend agreed to look over the contract, while a local historian, who happened to specialize in small-town businesses, offered to examine the photos. The lawyer confirmed what I'd suspected. The contract was incomplete, but it appeared to be an agreement involving Ryan and my parents. The historian was more interested in the photos. She pointed to one man in particular and said he'd been involved in a shady investment scheme years ago. Apparently, his name had come up in several local scandals. I felt like I was uncovering pieces of a puzzle that no one wanted me to solve. Ryan's role in the family business wasn't as simple as helping out during tough times. It seemed like he had positioned himself to benefit in ways my parents didn't fully understand, or maybe they did, and that's why they felt so guilty. I wasn't done yet. If there was more to this story, I was going to find it. Update 2. The historian's insight gave me a direction to follow. She confirmed that one of the men in the photos was linked to a failed investment scheme about 15 years ago. Apparently, it was a big deal in our town, a real estate project that promised massive returns but collapsed, leaving investors in financial ruin. If my dad was involved with this man, it might explain the financial struggles Mr. Davis mentioned. I showed the lawyer the partial contract I'd found in the box. He studied it and explained that it appeared to be a promissory note. It suggested Ryan had loaned money to my parents to help with the family business. That lined up with what Mr. Davis had said, but the contract was incomplete. Key pages were missing, including anything about repayment terms. With this new information, I confronted Ryan again. I waited until I knew he'd be home, then showed up at the house. This time, I wasn't leaving without answers. I brought up the contract and the photos and asked him why I was never told about any of this. At first, he acted like he didn't know what I was talking about. When I pressed him, his tone changed. He admitted he'd helped our parents financially, but he brushed it off like it wasn't a big deal. According to him, they had no other options, and he was just doing what needed to be done. When I asked if that's why the will was written the way it was, he got defensive. He claimed he had nothing to do with their decision, and that they were simply repaying him for his help. But something about his reaction felt off. He wasn't denying his involvement, but he was clearly hiding something. When I pushed further, he snapped and told me there was more to it but refused to explain. After that, I decided to dig deeper. I reached out to some extended family members again, hoping someone might have more information. Most of them still didn't want to get involved, but one of my cousins opened up. She remembered my parents talking about their financial troubles years ago, but what caught my attention was what she said next. They'd only consulted Ryan about their problems. She said my parents had deliberately kept me out of the loop because they didn't think I could help. And that stung, but it also confirmed something I'd suspected. They made decisions that affected the whole family but left me completely in the dark. My cousin hinted that there was a reason for this, but she wouldn't elaborate. She said it was something only my parents knew. I went back to the photos and the letter, trying to connect the dots. The letter's vague apology started to make more sense. It sounded like they regretted their choices but felt trapped. The photos told another story. I noticed several were taken near the same time as the failed investment scheme. My dad was meeting with people who might have been involved, which suggested he could have lost money in the collapse. If that's what happened, it might explain why they had to mortgage the house to fund Ryan's business venture. That's when I remembered the historian's comment about the shady businessman in the photo. I dug through the records I'd found earlier and spotted his name on one of the old invoices. My parents must have worked with him, though it wasn't clear how. Whatever the connection was, it had left them in such bad shape that they needed Ryan to step in. I started finding more letters tucked away in the box. They were from my dad, addressed to no one in particular, almost like journal entries. One of them mentioned the mortgage. He wrote about how they didn't have a choice but hoped Ryan's business would succeed and bring the family back together. That explained the financial side of things, but it didn't explain why they didn't split the inheritance fairly. If anything, it raised more questions. I decided to confront Ryan one last time. This time, I laid out everything I'd found, the contract, the photos, the letters. He looked annoyed more than anything. He dismissed it all as irrelevant and accused me of being petty. According to him, I didn't care about the family business back then, so I had no right to complain now. He said our parents made their choice, and I should learn to live with it. That was the final straw. I reached out to Mr. Davis again, and this time he offered to help me dig deeper. He told me the estate might be worth more than I realized. Apparently, some of the family's assets had appreciated significantly over the years, which made the inheritance imbalance even more glaring. If Ryan had manipulated our parents into favoring him, it wasn't just about sentiment, it was a deliberate financial move. With Mr. Davis's help, I started piecing together a plan. I needed more evidence, and I wasn't going to let Ryan's arrogance stop me. The truth was out there, and I was determined to expose it. Update 3. I kept digging, and what I uncovered painted a clearer picture of what had happened. Ryan's current wealth wasn't just a result of his hard work like he always claimed. It was built on the funds our parents had mortgaged their house for. The timeline was undeniable. Around the time my dad's letters mentioned the mortgage, Ryan's business took off. He used that money as a springboard, leaving my parents with nothing but debt. It wasn't just favoritism, it was a complete sacrifice. Then I found another letter. This one was from my mom, hidden in a stack of old tax documents. She wrote about how they believed helping Ryan would secure the family's future. She mentioned feeling guilty about their decision but hoped I would understand one day. It was clear they thought they were making the right choice for the family, even if it meant leaving me out. Around this time, Mr. Davis came through with more information. He mentioned an earlier draft of the will that split everything equally. He was sure it existed because my parents had consulted him when they first drafted it. He had no idea why they changed it but suggested I speak to the family lawyer who had handled the revisions. I tracked down the lawyer. She was hesitant to talk at first, but after I explained the situation, she agreed to meet. What she told me was shocking but not surprising. The earlier draft of the will had indeed divided everything equally between me and Ryan. But in the months leading up to their deaths, Ryan had been heavily involved in discussions with my parents about revising the will. While she couldn't say exactly what was discussed due to confidentiality, it was clear his influence had played a role in the changes. Armed with this information, I went back to Ryan. This time, I didn't hold back. I laid everything out, the earlier draft of the will, the mortgage, the letters, and the lawyer's account of his involvement. He didn't deny it. Instead, he doubled down. He said our parents made the right choice because he had been there for them when it Ryanered. He called me absent and said I didn't deserve anything because I didn't contribute to the family during their struggles. It turned into another shouting match, and I left more determined than ever to set the record straight. The word of our argument spread through the family like wildfire. Some relatives started questioning Ryan's integrity. Others accused me of being greedy and trying to dig up drama. It didn't take long for the family to split into factions. A few cousins openly sided with me, saying the whole situation was unfair. Others refused to get involved, claiming it wasn't their place to judge. The tension was palpable at every family gathering. Determined to get everything out in the open, I called for a family meeting. I wanted everyone to hear the full story so they could decide for themselves. I invited Ryan too, but he refused to come, calling it a waste of time. At the meeting, I presented everything I'd found, the letters, the photos, the partial contract, and the lawyer's confirmation of the earlier will draft. The family was shocked, and the room buzzed with whispered conversations. Some demanded answers from Ryan, while others looked uncomfortable and avoided eye contact. The breakthrough came when Mr. Davis shared another crucial piece of evidence. He had found a copy of the earlier will draft, complete with my parents' signatures. It wasn't legally binding, but it was proof that my parents originally intended to treat us equally. It added weight to my claims and cast even more doubt on Ryan's narrative. As the drama unfolded, I revisited the photos and noticed something new. Several showed Ryan with the same people my dad had met during the financial troubles. It was obvious Ryan had been more involved in those decisions than he let on. The photos painted a picture of collaboration between him and those who might have influenced my parents' choices. The fallout escalated quickly. Relatives started taking sides more openly. Some accused Ryan of manipulating our parents to secure his wealth. Others claimed I was stirring up unnecessary trouble. The arguments spilled over into group chats, and it felt like every family event became a battlefield. The backlash made me question whether this fight was worth it. Relatives who once supported me began to distance themselves, saying they didn't want to get caught in the middle. I considered dropping everything, but every time I looked at the letters or thought about my parents' regret, I knew I couldn't walk away. This wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the truth. With the earlier will draft as evidence, I decided to push forward. I reached out to Mr. Davis again, who offered to help me gather more proof. He also suggested consulting another lawyer who specialized in contested wills. I wasn't sure what my next move would be, but I knew one thing: I couldn't let Ryan get away with rewriting our family story. Update 4. Digging further into the family business records, I discovered how deep Ryan's manipulation ran. He had used the mortgage funds from our parents to secure several lucrative deals. On paper, it looked like he was taking a calculated risk, but the more I examined the documents, the clearer it became. He downplayed the risks to our parents. The deals were high stakes, and if they had failed, my parents would have lost everything. But Ryan never shouldered any of the danger himself. He leveraged their trust to his advantage, ensuring all the benefits flowed to him. Among my dad's letters, I found another clue. He wrote about how he believed Ryan would always do what's right for the family. That trust seemed to be the foundation of the will's final terms. My parents thought Ryan had proven himself reliable, so they felt safe leaving him in charge. but their trust had been misplaced. As the truth came to light, Ryan started losing support from our extended family. Relatives who initially dismissed my concerns began to distance themselves from him. At family gatherings, the whispers grew louder, and fewer people engaged with him. Ryan wasn't used to being questioned, and it showed. Then came the twist I didn't see coming. Ryan threatened to sue me for defamation. He claimed my investigations were damaging his reputation and causing unnecessary drama. He sent a formal notice through his lawyer, demanding I stop sharing false information with the family. It was a clear attempt to intimidate me, but I wasn't about to back down. Mr. Davis stepped up in a big way. He agreed to share his first-hand knowledge of my parents' financial struggles and how Ryan had positioned himself as the savior of the family business. His testimony strengthened my case and gave me the confidence to make a bold move. I decided it was time to take everything public, at least within the family. I sent out a detailed email to all our relatives, attaching the earlier will draft, my dad's letters, and the business records. I laid out the full story as clearly as I could. I knew it would stir up more drama, but I was past caring about that. If Ryan wanted to defend himself, he'd have to do it in front of everyone. The email worked. Within hours, my phone blew up with calls and messages from family members. Some were supportive, others were shocked, and a few accused me of trying to tarnish Ryan's reputation. Ryan, meanwhile, panicked. He made a public statement to the family, denying all the accusations. He claimed the will reflected our parents' wishes and accused me of being bitter and irresponsible. But he didn't offer any proof to back his claims. Just as things seemed to hit a boiling point, another relative came forward with more letters. They'd been tucked away in an old storage box and had been written by my parents during the height of their financial troubles. The letters expressed deep regret about their decisions, but also a firm belief that they were protecting the family by putting everything in Ryan's hands. It was heartbreaking to read, but it also revealed how trapped they must have felt. Despite the mounting pressure, I refused to stop. I wasn't just fighting for the inheritance anymore, I was fighting for my parents' legacy and my place in the family. The more I uncovered, the more determined I became to see this through. That's when Mr. Davis hinted at another secret. He mentioned an estranged relative who had been written out of the will long before I was born. He didn't know much, but he thought their story might shed some light on the patterns within our family. Tracking down this relative wasn't easy, but I eventually found them. They were hesitant to talk at first, but when I explained my situation, they opened up. Their story was eerily similar. Years ago, my grandparents had cut them out of their inheritance under suspicious circumstances. They believed they'd been betrayed by a family member who manipulated the situation to their advantage. It seemed history was repeating itself, and Ryan had learned from the past. As I pieced everything together, I learned about a hidden clause in the final will. According to Mr. Davis, there might be a way to contest it, but it would require more evidence and the help of an estate lawyer specializing in family disputes. Ryan's behavior became more erratic. He started spreading rumors about me, accusing me of being irresponsible and ungrateful. He claimed I was only pursuing this because I'd failed in life and wanted to blame him for my problems. I ignored his attempts to discredit me and focused on gathering more evidence. With the support of Mr. Davis and a few sympathetic relatives, I compiled everything I had: the letters, the earlier will draft, the business records, and the estranged relative's testimony. It was a mountain of evidence, and I was ready to take it to the estate lawyer. I wasn't sure what the outcome would be, but I knew one thing. The truth was finally coming to light, and Ryan's carefully constructed image was beginning to crumble. It was time to take the next step. Update 5. The day I filed the legal challenge against the will, it felt like stepping into a storm. My lawyer, an estate specialist recommended by Mr. Davis, explained that proving undue influence wouldn't be easy. The earlier will draft and the letters were compelling, but we needed to show that Ryan had manipulated our parents during their most vulnerable time. Ryan wasted no time responding. He hired a high-powered lawyer and continued to deny any wrongdoing. His defense painted him as the dutiful son who had been unfairly maligned by his bitter sibling. He framed everything as a simple case of our parents making a rational decision to reward him for stepping up when the family needed help. It was a narrative he'd been pushing for months, and now he had professionals backing him. As the case moved forward, the family split grew wider. Some relatives, frustrated with the escalating drama, cut ties with Ryan entirely. Others doubled down on their support for him, insisting I was dragging everyone into a mess that should have stayed private. Group chats disbanded, holiday plans were canceled, and the family fractured in ways I hadn't imagined possible. Then, while organizing some of my parents' remaining belongings, I found something unexpected: an old cassette tape. It was buried in a box labeled Memories, alongside photos and trinkets. I borrowed a tape player to listen to it, and what I heard stunned me. It was my dad's voice, recorded not long before their deaths. He spoke about the inheritance, his regrets, and how he wished he could have made different decisions. He mentioned feeling pressured to protect the family, and how he hoped Ryan would do what was right. It wasn't a direct admission of manipulation, but it was clear my dad hadn't been fully confident in the choices they'd made. The tape became a game changer. My lawyer added it to the growing pile of evidence, and the family lawyer who had drafted the earlier will agreed to testify. She confirmed that Ryan had been involved in revising the will, frequently meeting with my parents in their final months. She described the pressure they were under and hinted that Ryan's influence had been more significant than he let on. The case finally went to court. It was a tense battle from start to finish. Ryan's lawyer argued that the will reflected my parents' true intentions and accused me of trying to rewrite history out of jealousy. My lawyer countered by presenting the earlier will draft, the letters, and the tape. I took the stand, walking the court through the timeline of events, my discoveries, and how Ryan's actions had undermined our parents' original wishes. The turning point came during Ryan's cross-examination. Under pressure, his carefully constructed narrative began to crumble. The opposing lawyer pressed him about his meetings with my parents and the mortgage funds he'd used for his business. His answers became evasive, and his frustration was obvious. When confronted with the tape and the family lawyer's testimony, he faltered. His image of the perfect son was starting to unravel. Then came a twist no one saw coming. The court uncovered a loophole in the final will. A poorly worded clause left room for partial redistribution of the estate if undue influence could be proven. This revelation turned the tide in my favor. Ryan's lawyer tried to argue against it, but the evidence was overwhelming. In the end, the judge ruled in my favor. I was granted a fair share of the estate, enough to give me closure and a sense of justice. Ryan stormed out of the courtroom, refusing to speak to me or most of the family. From what I heard later, he's cut ties with several relatives who sided with me, isolating himself further. With the legal battle behind me, I took some time to reflect. The fight had been exhausting, but it was worth it to honor my parents' true intentions. Some estranged relatives reached out, expressing regret for not supporting me earlier. While the family will never be the same, there's a sense of healing in those reconnections. I used my share of the inheritance to start fresh. I moved to a new city, found a job I love, and finally put the family drama behind me. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that transparency and fairness are worth fighting for. Family secrets can weigh you down, but they don't have to define your future. This chapter of my life is closed, and I'm ready to write a new one.